Hi, I'm Andrew Sears, and in this lesson, I'm going to be talking about the 5 approaches to counseling in Christianity. But in this talk, I'm going to really focus on the practical implications of this. Now, in our Introduction to Christian Addiction Counseling course, we use this book called Counseling in Christianity, 5 Approaches. And the 5 approaches that they talk about are biblical counseling, transformational counseling, Christian psychology, the integration model, and levels of explanation. Now, what's important to recognize about these approaches is these aren't just, theoretical debates. There's huge communities of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that follow kind of these schools of thought, and there's, big overlap between them. That's part of why I have these concentric circles going. Now, one of the ways I think that's helpful to think about framing these different perspectives is, where do you work? Where are you called? Now, the Bible, to paraphrase it, says we're supposed to be in the world, but not of it. So many people have used the term the church gathered. So that could be the church on Sunday, or it could be your small group, or it could be a Christian ministry or rescue mission. And often that's more in the not of the world category. But then you have the church scattered. And rather than saying in the world, I like using the phrase sent into the world. And in the church scattered. So there's a question of where is your call? How much of your call is based in the church versus based, in being sent into the world. So if your call is much more in the church or in ministries, then you're going to do more biblical counseling. If your call is to be sent into the world and to work in secular environments, then it's going to be levels of explanation. And then you might have here in the middle, it might be Christian counselors and Christian organizations that take insurance, or it might be Christian counselors and secular organizations. But what's important is that over your career, you might change between these. You might start working for a ministry that does biblical counseling, but what happens if all of a sudden your next job is, secular, and you're only trained in biblical counseling? That's going to be a challenge, or vice versa. So for many Christians, it can be helpful to understand all 5 of these perspectives. Now, another question that is really important is, do you want to be licensed? So licensing is something that's provided by the government. In the U.S., it's generally handled by the states. My rough estimate is roughly 95% of the jobs of people who are getting paid to do counseling, full-time, are going to be licensed counselors. So the question is, if you want to be a licensed counselor, then you probably need to follow one of these models over here, and just recognize that biblical counselors are not going to be licensed unless they pursue licensing and training from another perspective. Now, biblical counselors might be ordained, or they might work with an association that grants them a credential, but they're not going to be licensed by the state because the state doesn't get involved in that type of thing. So another question is, who are your clients? So if you're doing biblical counseling, in most cases, most of your clients are going to be evangelical or fundamentalist. In most cases, it might, be Christian, non-evangelical Christians. And then over on this side, you have most clients are not going to be Christian. So that's another question to consider these different approaches. Now, the other is, what's your call? Are you called to be a pastor? Are you called to be a lay biblical counselor? Are you called to be a witness into secular context? Are you called to be a scientist in psychology, or a practicing psychologist? So what your call is going to determine which of these schools of thought you might work with. Now, I'm not explaining all of these in detail because we're going to have each week where we go in much more detail. So there's another question, which is, where are you being educated? So if, biblical counseling is preeminent typically at a seminary, a Bible school, or a theology department. And that's really important to recognize because, often, that's one of the biggest differences on these things. Now, these other perspectives typically come at a Christian university in a counseling or psychology department. So we have Christian addiction counseling. So we're spanning kind of this whole domain here, right? We're covering all of this, and we also, have biblical counseling that we do also. And then secular universities or our more liberal Christian universities really going to only focus on levels of explanation. So another question is, how strong is the Christian worldview in your integration? Now, some people would say that it goes completely from left to right, but I don't think that's true. You could have a weak, secularized Christian worldview, and you could be any of these models. Some people might say that they're following the Bible, but their worldview actually isn't biblical. So it's important to recognize that, okay, there might be a trend that as you move to the right, there's a higher percentage of secularization and secularization of worldview, but someone could follow the integration model and have a strong Christian worldview. Now, another thing to look at, and this is kind of the way I like to think about it, is you could condense the 5 approaches really into 3 approaches. So you have one group that is an anti-integration group, and basically this group is the Bible only, no science. And then the secular counseling is science only, so it's secular only, no Bible. And then you have Christian counseling integration that includes all 3 of the middle groups, and maybe some biblical counselors that are amenable to that, and some secular. Now, within this, you're going to have 2 groups. You're going to have the strong integration, where you have a biblical worldview that's dominant, and then you're going to have weak integration, where you have a secular worldview that's dominant. Now, I'll go a little more into what I mean by worldview. So let's talk about these 3 dominant cultures to counseling in Christianity. So you have the anti-integration, the Christian integration, and the secular. So what's the primary context you work? And this is just kind of a summary of what we've covered so far. So anti-integration might be in churches and conservative missionary organizations. So, and then Christian integration might be Christian counseling centers and universities. And this isn't going to be, universally true. And secular is going to be secular counseling centers. Then anti-integration might be more on the fundamentalist Christians with some evangelical. And then Christian integration is going to be Christian or secular, depending on the context. Who are the clients that you're counseling, is what we're covering here. And then, secular, you're mainly going to be serving non-Christians. Is it licensed? Anti-integration, you're not going to be licensed, following that. And there's going to be few paid jobs unless you're a pastor. Christian integration, moderate level of jobs and pay. And secular has the highest level of jobs and pay. The approach to Christian counseling of the 5 models. So anti-integration, that is traditional biblical counseling. Now we'll talk about later, there's a difference between traditional biblical counseling and what's called progressive biblical counseling, which allows for some integration but is very wary of integration. Then you have these 3 approaches: integration, Christian psychology, and transformational counseling. And then you have a levels of explanation approach. And there's another approach that we're not really even covering, which is what I just categorized as there's a whole lot of groups that are out there that kind of really militantly anti-religious secularist. So where are you being educated? Seminaries, Bible schools, or theology departments, Christian counseling department at a Christian university, or a secular university or more liberal Christian university. What's your call? Pastors, witnesses in mixed contents, witnesses in secular contents. These are some of the key, hot button issues. So anti-integration generally is going to be traditional marriage on the LGBT versus traditional marriage. Christian integration for evangelicals, typically that's going to be traditional marriage. It may vary depending on what denomination that you're talking about, if it's non-evangelical. And then secular is just going to follow the dominant culture, which is currently in the U.S. is LGBT rights largely are valued over traditional religious understanding of marriage for evangelical Christians. So the risk of Christian counselors being secularized for the anti-integration group, that's small. Christian integration group, that's moderate. And the secular group is, by nature, it's higher, already secularized. And a common quote, the anti-integration, it's the sufficiency of Scripture. Christian integration, it's all truth is God's truth. and secular, it's basically saying that religion's in a different domain. And the risk, each side has a risk of, are you going to become legalistic? And the anti-integration side, I would say, is that there's a high risk of being legalistic from a conservative perspective. The integrationists are less risk of legalism, and the secularists, honestly, are at higher risk of liberal legalism. So another way of framing all this is, what are the boundaries that City Vision's trying to cover? What are we trying to include? We largely follow the Lausanne Statement and Declaration on Care and Counsel as Mission. So that was established in Cape Town. Lausanne is the largest gathering of Bible-believing Christians that take the Bible very seriously. It was founded by Billy Graham. It represents 95% of evangelicals, and I use that term broadly because most of the world doesn't interpret evangelical in the same way as the U.S., where it's tied to politics. And basically what we say is, Billy Graham had a very big tent that covered a lot of Christians, and we're trying to basically span that. Same thing with the Lausanne Covenant, is we're trying to basically say, things that are on the far left over on the far left over here, basically any anti-biblical teachings, anything. A lot of people, in this space just say all biblical counseling is evil. So, we're going to say that's outside of the bounds for us. That's not something we're going to be supportive. We're going to call that out. There's an attitude in some highly fundamentalist circles. I once attended a fundamentalist church where they basically thought most people who weren't a part of this church were probably going to hell. They never said it, but you could kind of tell. There's some who are on, within that perspective where, anyone who's doing anything but biblical counseling is basically completely misguided and maybe not going to hell, but maybe going to hell is kind of the stance. And we don't want to throw, there's a lot of people who are called to work, in secular contexts, and we don't want to throw them under the bus. We also don't want to throw the biblical counselors under the bus. So that's ultimately, what we care about here. So why learn the 5 approaches to counseling in Christianity? Well, there's the phrase, the law of the instrument. If all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. So you're going to hopefully have a long career in this space, and you need to equip students with different calls. We have a lot of students with different calls. Some are called to, be in the church gathered. Some are called to the church scattered. For a variety of counseling settings, some of you will be called to counsel in the church or in Christian organizations, and then you might go into a secular context, then you might go back into a Christian context. You don't know where you're going to go, and you're going to have a range of clients. You may be even in a church and be a biblical counselor, but you may have someone who you ultimately counsel that's not a Christian. So you want to have frameworks that are helpful. So ultimately, one of the verses we follow, 1 Corinthians 13:12, for now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know even as I am known. So each of these perspectives is kind of a different colored lens, and you might need different lenses in different sorts of contexts. So we want you, the idea, I think if you can combine some of these lenses, part of the way light works is if you combine the colors, then you actually get white light that includes all of these. Now that's harder for us to do because just as fallen people, we have a hard time, combining perspectives. We can only kind of have on one pair of glasses at a time, right? Now, another way of framing this is I like the idea of having a balanced diet. So here in the U.S., they're promoting, the balanced plate. They say you're supposed to have a section of fruits, grains, vegetables, protein, and then, this was probably the dairy lobby that made sure that dairy was on the plate, right? I like to think the same thing for well-rounded Christian counseling education. Now, you might have Christian psychology here, biblical counseling here, integration, transformational perspective, and then levels of explanation. I kind of put them separate because that's not our core plate. That's kind of a side, for us. And some of you may decide, just like looking at this, some people may become vegan, and some people may become, what they call, paleo, where you eat a lot of, meat and protein and things along those lines. And there's ways to be healthy being vegan. There's ways to be healthy eating a lot of protein. And some of you may decide that you're going to major in one of these domains, and that's great. But it's going to be hard for you to predict where you're going to go through your whole life. So we want you to cover all of these perspectives so that you have it covered as you move forward. Now, another important quote that I like is, to think about on this is a quote by John Culkin. We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us. So what that means is it's not just that, if you're a hammer, everything's a nail. If all you're using is a hammer every day, well, that's going to develop your muscles differently than if you're using a screwdriver and a hammer and a shovel, or if you use a shovel. And part of the reason why that's important is because there's so much more money in secular counseling, so much more money in secular training. It can be easy to become like this guy. So this guy, he was born with one arm much bigger than the other, but he decided that was going to be his thing, and he was going to only work out that one arm. So he became a champion, arm wrestler. But the point is that this is what happens naturally if you don't try to kind of resist the pull of the current, because there's a lot more opportunities to have practice and training in the secular worldview, and you're going to have one muscle because you're overusing that tool set that is overdeveloped, and then you have practice and training in Christian worldview. And I use this because it kind of stands out, how big a difference that this guy's arms are. And the reality is most people would never say, in their heads that this is what they're doing. But if you're using this tool all the time, all your training's in this tool, and you haven't done any reading, any training using this tool, and you haven't been practicing this, then ultimately, even if you took courses and you're taking courses at City Vision, in 10 years, you're going to need to continue to deepen this part, right? And recognizing that Christian integration and Christian counseling is its own field. So you need to continue to develop and grow in this domain. So hopefully this is helpful. We're going to go into a lot more detail of each of these perspectives. And, if you find this video helpful, you can go to cityvisioninstitute.org, and you can share and find out more about our free Introduction to Christian Counseling course that you can share with your friends on that website. So thanks a lot.